So this is information that was reported through CalPads. I do want to note that this is data from the 16-17 school year because that's what's available right now on the CalPads. In November, the new information will be released through the state. So that's why we're looking at this from this school year. I want you to take a look at the groups that are listed up there, and we have in this middle column right here, we have Kern County chronic absence rate versus the state absence rate. So just take a look at what's on the screen and see what kind of catches your attention with that. All of this information or the ethnicities are self-reported by families, so if they choose not to report, that's what this number is. So these percentages should probably fall somewhere in here. They've just chosen not to self-report so that the numbers would actually fluctuate if we knew what this was. Okay, so these are the different ethnic groups. I want you to also take a look at these other subgroups: English learners, foster youth, homeless youth, migrant ed, socioeconomically disadvantaged, and students with disabilities. What are you noticing between Kern and state? What catches your attention here? Okay, pretty close. Any numbers of those that are particularly high? Or when I look at this, the percentage of foster and homeless just freaks me out. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 kids in those subgroups are chronically absent. When you think about outcomes, if they're not in school, it's difficult for them to be successful. It's a challenge. One thing that when I look at this, I would always want to know is this category of students with disabilities. I would want more detailed information about what are the eligibilities within this group. What are the percentages based on eligibility? Like, are your kids that are designated as OHI, other health impaired, are their chronic absence rates significantly higher? Are your kids who are designated as emotionally disturbed, do they have a higher rate? I would want to know within that category what the eligibilities were and how that might play out. Because if I'm tasked with supporting students in that group, I would want to have an idea of what that looks like and where they are. So maybe eventually, like I said, it would be really great with all of this we talked about earlier. State SARB is really pushing for not just this information, but this broken down by excused, unexcused, and suspension. Because then you could even do more targeted interventions based on that. We're not there yet. We hope to be there someday, but it would be great with all of these subgroups to have more detailed information that would be actionable for us. What I want you to do now is, when you came in, Sal gave you some data for your, what I tried to give you was, the front page is typically the district data for the schools within your district. So it might compare you, if you're at a school site, with other schools in your district. If you're a district person, you can see the chronic absence rates for the school in your district. The pages behind that are the breakdown of chronic absenteeism for your ethnic groups and then your other subgroups. So this is for either your school district, if you're a district person, or your school site, if you're a school site. So what I want you to do is to review your information as it compares to Kern and to the state to see where you are. Does your district or your school site kind of mirror what's happening in the county and in the state, or are you seeing some big differences in terms of your data? So I want you to look at that and compare. I want you to think about the needs of the subgroups in your district or within your school site with the highest rates of chronic absenteeism, and then think about how will an analysis of this data help you respond. Okay, so I'll put it back on some of this data here. Maybe we'll start here. But look at your school site or your district, compare the data, look at your disproportionate subgroups, and think about how you might need to respond to those. Because that's going to play into the duties, your duties as an attendance supervisor as well. Knowing the data, knowing what's there, knowing how to respond to it.
You know, looking at the data, because we've looked at it before, the big difference, at least for us, I'm sure the other districts as well, is when you compare the grade levels to grade levels. Because right now, as it stands, when you look at chronic absenteeism for the current high school district, we're just above the state average, but when you compare us to 9 through 12 amongst the states, then we're 3% lower than the state average. So, you know, you kind of have to look at that aspect of it as well.
Okay, so the more you can drill down into those pieces too. Good. Did your data seem to reflect some consistencies along the lines of where the county and the state are? Were you pretty closely aligned, or were there any of your subgroups that were way off? Yes, a couple of you were saying yes.
We're a Title I school, so, you know, we're pretty much all socioeconomically disadvantaged, and our number is less than the state, so.
Okay, so good.
We've got some successes there.
Good. That's a great statistic then. And I think that's an important thing to bring up is the information that appears here is information that was provided by the districts. So if there are some numbers that look like they're off for you, then those are kind of signs or triggers of maybe we need to take a look a little more closely at the information that's going in. Because if how we're inputting information, how we're recording information, how we're identifying kids in subgroups, if there's some issues with how that looks in our systems, that's what ends up getting reported to the state. So it may just be a signal that we have to spend a little more time cleaning up some of those pieces and maybe talking with some of the people who are responsible for inputting data to make sure that the data is clean. Because what you put in is what you're going to end up getting out. So we do have to look at that. So thank you for reminding us about that. In terms of communication and response, so a few questions. This one is more thinking about after you've identified, you have all these different pieces of data. You have data in your student information systems, your A2A, your DAT, your surveys, everything else. So after you have the information, how are you responding to it? Now that you know what your subgroups are, you know where there's disproportionality, you know where some of your challenges lie, how are you responding to it? So some things I would want you to think about. Who has access to the data? So as a district, there's someone who makes a decision about who has access to what data. Is it concentrated with a certain department, or is it open to everybody? Do school sites have access? Who at the school sites have access? Is it just the administrators, or is it attendance people? Is it additional support staff? What does that look like? How is attendance information communicated out to other audiences? So is one person responsible for pushing out information to people and they know who to expect it from? And how often is that data communicated? Does it go out daily? Does it go out weekly? Does it go out every 2 weeks? Does it go out every month? Thinking about the timeliness of the response based on when that goes out. How are expectations about intervention and follow-up communicated? So people's roles and responsibilities. Talking to Delano, they have very specific people that are lined up in terms of who's supposed to do what, who's responsible for home visits, how they play into this piece. So thinking about that, how that's communicated with job descriptions and things like that. How are the interventions and outcomes tracked? So once you know what's going on and you start implementing the interventions, how are you tracking that? And how do you know when resources need to be adjusted or reallocated? So you may have had 1 year, there may have been disproportionality with your homeless foster. The next year when you look at your data, you might notice that your socioeconomically disadvantaged increased significantly. So I just want you to keep those things in the back of your mind. One recommendation I would have is to develop attendance improvement plans. I know there's a few people in the room who came to the training that we did in May, where we focused more specifically on how do you develop plans at both the district and or site level to really address this. Once you have the data and you know what you need to put in place, what supports and resources, how do you formalize that into a plan that's able to be utilized at your district level and at your school sites? So in those plans, think about what are your goals, activities, and who are the staff that are going to be responsible for that. They should be reviewed and revised annually based on updated attendance data. So for some of you that came to the previous one, hopefully you were able to maybe work on that over the summer and get those plans in place. If you weren't able to join us last May, then that may be something that you want to consider for this year based on the data that you do have, the goals you have, your LCAP goals. Think about that attendance improvement plan and putting that into place as an activity you could do with administrators. All right, so moving on to duties and goals number 3. With this one, attendance supervisors need to identify and address factors that are contributing to chronic absenteeism and habitual truancy, including suspension and expulsion. So this one is really what are the factors that are contributing to that? You have data, so you kind of know who your groups are and what those numbers look like, but underlying that, what are the factors? So yes, you know your homeless group or your foster group is high, but what are the factors contributing to that? So think about, you know, some of the barriers that might be in place. So same thing, you can flip your sheet over, your grid, your chart. Flip that over and look at number 3. Again, this is kind of a two-parter. How do you identify the factors and how do you address the factors? What are you doing right now? All of you are doing this to some extent and with certain groups. Just jot down your ideas of what you're doing. Okay, so what are how do you identify and address factors contributing to chronic absenteeism and habitual truancy? Suspension and expulsion are a piece of that. So thinking about what else are you seeing? What are some of the factors that are leading to this? Yes?
A big thing we've had to deal with are the political pieces.
Yes, okay. So what does that look like in your area?
It could be staged walkouts, you know,
Okay.
political protests.
Okay.
Recently was the Parkland event, the
Okay.
Parkland shooting.
Okay. So safety could be another. Okay. I don't know if it's true in this area. In Southern California, one of the other political factors with issues related to immigration, a lot of families just said, I am not. We had a really high profile incident in Los Angeles where a father that dropped his daughter off to school got picked up by ICE in front of the school. So, I mean, attendance dropped off everywhere after that. That got a little scary. But anything else? What else are we seeing that are some of the factors?
Some of the factors related to Common Core and testing, so there's a lot of activity going on there.
Okay. Other things that contribute?
So for high school kids, we see a lot of lack of supervision, parents that
Yes.
work multiple jobs, so they're not
Okay.
home to make sure their kids are getting off to school,
Okay.
or their students are staying home to care for younger siblings or family members.
Sometimes the holidays, there's some parents that do not celebrate certain holidays, and so then they just thinking that we're gonna have a you don't call it party, yeah, like classroom celebration.
Oh, okay. Okay. They don't want them to participate in certain things. Okay. And I think across the board, as we get into the afternoon and we're talking about the SARB process, that's something that I think is the biggest trend in terms of cases that we're seeing, is really addressing and identifying students, well, and families. It's not always just the students. Sometimes it's, you know, the family members who are having mental health issues, but it impacts the kids because they feel like someone has to be home with someone, or, you know, it's not properly dealt with, and so there's some issues related to that. But trauma for sure. Our kids that are experiencing trauma and how they're dealing with that, adjusting to that, and are they getting the support they need? Other ideas? How else are we identifying? And did you have something? Absolutely. There's a lot of earning the trust of families, especially ones who are just entering our systems, the TK, the kinders. There's a lot of, I'm most qualified to take care of my child, so if they're not feeling 100%, I don't necessarily have a relationship or trust the school with my child. So part of that is, again, the parent education and maybe some of those workshops related to health, wellness, when to send your kids to school, when to keep them home, educating on those pieces. And it goes back to relationship and trust building, but that's kind of how it manifests. Yes. Anything else? Okay, that's a good list for us to start with. So a few other things sources of information. So again, going back to how are you identifying this and what some of these issues are, how are you finding this out? Attendance codes. I would go back and look at your attendance codes and what's being reported. Are things being reported as illnesses? Are they being reported as appointments? Sometimes we get misleading information. We were having a conversation over here about parents might report one thing, but then when you talk to the student, they might tell you something else. Parent says the child was absent. Child says Disneyland. So So sometimes the codes don't always work because people have learned how to manipulate the system, but attendance codes is a good place to start because it gives you a sense of are the majority of our absences illnesses, or are they for other reasons? What are we looking at? Discipline data, so again, because it specifically called out suspension, expulsion, make sure we look at our discipline data to see how that's impacting attendance. The personal conversations, so when parents are calling in the illnesses or coming into the offices, having conversations with parents about why was your child out, what happened, talking them through that. That's where it's great if you have some of those flyers or materials related to the impacts of attendance available for parents. One strategy that I saw a school do is we did these little newsletters on a monthly basis based on attendance. And so they would print copies of the newsletter and keep it in the attendance office. And every time a parent showed up and wanted to pull their student out of class or said, my student will be out the next couple days for a family emergency or whatever, they would give them a copy of this as kind of like a subtle reminder that attendance is really important, our numbers count, we're looking at our numbers, and the decisions that you're making impact them. So they'd have the conversation, of course, about, next time let's try to make the appointment after school, or let's not plan a family vacation, but then they would also give them this as kind of the backup for it. So you can always do something creative like that. SART and SARB information. You collect information as part of your SART contract or your SARB contract. There's usually someone there who's keeping track of what the reasons are that you're having the meeting to start with. So pulling information from that or from your student information systems if you're entering it into your systems. Data from school climate programs. So if some of you are using like PBIS, they have their own tracking system related to PBIS. So that's another means of pulling information. And then again, surveys, asking people directly, what are some of the factors that are contributing to this? Why are you missing school? How does this play out for you? We know what some of the factors are contributing to poor attendance. We've touched on a lot of them here. We're going to talk about these in more detail this afternoon, so I don't really want to focus on it too much now. But we do know that there are some pretty common reasons that students don't come to school. It's our job as school personnel to figure out how to address that and provide the supports for families. In terms of responding to some of those factors, so again, kind of from a bigger perspective, from the district perspective, one thing you can do is compile or update a district-wide inventory of community resources with contact information for partners who can help address those factors. I know you guys have, through the track program, you guys have an inventory that was put together. Sal has an updated version of it, so we'll make sure that we get those out to people. But thinking about that as a means of, if a family comes in and tells you they're having this particular issue, maybe it is asthma related. Okay, well, now that we've identified that, then let's get a medical release. Let's try to, if we need to develop a health plan, let's get you linked up with a local community group who can help you. Maybe they can come in and do in-home assessments to see what's triggering asthma. Make sure that you're have a treatment plan that's in place that's effective for you. We just need to be able to have that response for families when they come to us. Collaborate with community partners and develop MOUs for district and or school-based services. Consider a community school approach. So this is where things are located, co-located on campuses, so that if there's a medical issue, there's a clinic on campus. If there's a mental health issue, there are therapists that are available on campus. So you're not referring people out. The school is the community hub. So that's something to consider. It's expensive, but it's something to consider. Implement programs to address school climate issues. If that's coming up, they weren't really identified here, but in the past we've seen issues of the bullying and cyberbullying as a reason that kids aren't coming to school. So thinking about school climate, safety issues. Do kids feel safe on campus? We know that after the Parkland situation, we saw dips in attendance kind of across the board. So we do know that safety is on the mind of our kids and parents as well. So thinking about that. Specifically for subgroups, when you have the data and you're looking at subgroups, think about the factors within that. If you're at the district level, try to provide updated information to school sites about students in the targeted subgroups. If the numbers have shifted, the kids have shifted, make sure that they have an accurate idea of who those kids are. Identify common barriers and then supports and resources for them. Reach out to staff within the district who support the subgroups. Coordinate efforts to make sure that possible barriers to attendance are addressed. In reaching out and working together, if you are working with your foster liaison, your McKinney-Vento person, You may have your EL coordinator, some of these different subgroups, your Title I people. Coordinate those efforts so that you're working together. Well, that went really fast, sorry. Okay, number 4. Are you feeling like there's a lot of duties now, updated duties for supervisors? Okay, don't feel too overwhelmed. That's not the point of this. The point is we're trying to get ideas because realizing that you're going to be tasked to do this work, at least those of you who have raised your hands at the beginning. Those of you who raised your hands at the beginning are now really starting to point at people around you and saying you're going to be my assistant supervisors of attendance. Ensure that pupils with attendance problems are identified as early as possible to provide support services and early warning systems. So basically, how are you catching those kids who are missing school? What early warning systems do you have in place to be able to figure out who they are and that they're not falling through the cracks? Okay, so that's the next thing I want you to take a look at your tables, in your groups. Go ahead and talk through this. But think about how are you ensuring that pupils with attendance problems are identified as early as possible? Because you don't want a situation where someone pops up on your radar after 25 absences. Okay, so let's share for number 4. And just from walking around the room and hearing the conversations, I'm really excited by this because I think it used to be, years ago, we would kind of wait for a student to be brought to our attention by a counselor or by a teacher. Oh, did you know? Or something. We didn't have these really great early warning systems in place. We kind of waited to be told and we're reactive versus being proactive. So in walking around the room and hearing some of the things that you're doing proactively to figure out who these kids are and catch them early, I'm really excited about that. So if we could share out, how are those students being identified? What are you doing to ensure that you're catching the students early? Okay, I know my table over there. I knew I was going to go to you. No, they had great ideas. So can you tell us what you're doing to identify your kids?
We use Aries Analytics, and we've created hot lists from Aries Analytics. We run queries on our chronic absentees and our prior year DSARB students. We just track a lot of those students.
Okay. And then with that, you were saying that you guys push out information to the sites and help them create dashboards so that site administrators are able to see everything they need to see really quickly.
Right, with Aries Analytics, yeah, we've created dashboards for them. They can just jump in there and they can pull the information and see what students have, who are their top at-risk students.
Okay. So you're able to help get the information together and create the system for them, and then it's their responsibility as site people to do the follow-up with those kids. But there's a lot of communication back and forth. So again, you're catching them, or you're looking at even kids that had been SARB'd in the past to keep track of them to continue monitoring. So that's a good example of a system that's in place to be able to address that, and that's through Aries Analytics. Anyone else have anything different? Other things that you do?
We start off busy in the first couple days of school with all the no-show lists, but since we're high school only and we get all the kids coming in grade in, so we have a couple hundreds of kids that we're going out and looking for that did not show, and then obviously we started looking at all the attendance reports as the letters start going out, which one's to target, but we'll be busy for about 2 weeks on the no-show list.
Okay. And that's a busy time at the beginning of the year, because as much as we would love for parents to be in great communication with us about what their plans are and where they're going and what they're doing, sometimes that doesn't happen. So that leaves us with the task of figuring out who they are, because again, you may have kids who are sitting on your rolls that aren't yours, or they are yours, they've just chosen to take an extended summer break and not come back to you. So to figure out how to work with that. Anything else to add to the list? So that's another group where you talked about monitoring the SARB kids. You're talking about going back and monitoring the severely chronic kids from the year before, because whether they were SARB'd or not, that's another audience to take a look at. So continuing with that, that's good. Anyone else? No? Okay. Yeah.
We do the same as Brian. We track our no-shows because we're pretty proud of our graduation rate, and we don't want them to become a dropout. So we also look for them in CalPads, make sure they show up in a different school. If they've moved, then we make sure that they
Right.
get enrolled there.
Right, so you want to follow up with kids that way. Good, so all of those are great ideas. In addition to that, think about your early warning system, whatever that looks like in your district. So some of you are using your student information system and add-ons, some of you might be using A2A, some of you might be using your previous SARB stuff or lists and reports that you're generating from the previous year. But looking at that system and creating what works in your district. There's not a one size fits all, that's why there's so many different programs out there. But make sure that whatever reports you're using, you're able to get the information in real time. It doesn't really help you to look at it at the quarter or at the semester because you're really looking for timely interventions. So whatever system you're using, make sure that you can get the turnaround information as quickly as possible. Communicate that data to school sites and personnel, so kind of the example that we have over here of how they use the dashboards. And then again, if you're a district person, identify which school sites might need additional resources based on those higher rates of truancy and chronic absenteeism. Geographically within your district, and some of you that had your data, you may have noticed that within your district there are certain areas where chronic absenteeism is higher. There's clusters. And there could be geographic reasons for that. Maybe transportation isn't as readily available in that area. Maybe there are some specific health-related concerns in certain parts of the community. Maybe different housing situations. All of those things could come into play. So thinking about if you have some sites based on your data who are really struggling, you may need to reallocate resources to those areas to help. Utilizing the SARB process, that's part of these different steps towards leading towards SARB. We're going to talk about that this afternoon a little bit more. But making sure that you've developed guidance for school sites about the steps of the process to make sure for the sake of compliance and consistency, everyone should be on the same page about how you're doing things. Sometimes left to our own devices, we kind of create systems at the school sites that work for us, but it's not consistent across the district. And especially when you're dealing with SARB, where all the cases are going to come to one body, you need to make sure there's consistency. And then again, that linkage with partners. Okay, we are on number 5. We are on the last updated duty of supervisors of attendance. Whew. Okay, so now it is also your responsibility to evaluate the effectiveness of strategies implemented to reduce chronic absenteeism rates. So not only are you raising awareness, looking at data, figuring out what the factors are, and then developing these early warning systems, you then have to evaluate, is it working? Because if it's not working, right, that's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again with the same results. So think about how you either are doing this or need to start doing this, evaluating the effectiveness of those strategies. So what does this look like? And on your chart, if this hasn't been something that's been a part of what you're doing, that's okay. If you are evaluating your strategies, explain to us how you're doing that. So let's take a look at what you came up with for evaluating effectiveness. How do you know that the strategies you're using, what you've implemented, what you're putting into place, how do you know if it's working? How are you doing that evaluation?
Well, generally it's immediate feedback as the student starts attending more regularly.
Okay, so you start to see it with data based on whether they're turning around, whether they're coming to school, whether that's reducing.
Monitor each student individually.
Okay. So that's the outcome you want, absolutely.
With us, we use A2A and we put the student on academic attendance and payment plan.
Okay.
So we monitor them for a few weeks, see if they're progressing or not, and then they'll be on our A5s.
Okay.
Keep a close eye on it.
Okay, so your watch list, yes. What else?
We get data, and then we actually talk to the students.
Yes.
Right, we try to do a good job of talking to them. We do a lot of student strategic, and so we will fishbowl them, we will have several conversations, but like, we were constantly asking all the time, the population, and all of a sudden you're not. We want to know what worked out of all of that stuff.
Right. That personal piece. A lot of what we've talked about today has kind of been data and outcomes, but we can't forget that personal piece because that gives us a very rich conversation to work with. And maybe some things that give us ideas for what would work for other students.
I'll tell you, in the past, we actually found out some unusual things, like kids saying, well, I thought this teacher didn't like me, so I just skipped the class. And the teacher had nothing against any of those kids, but it was just something they were.
Perception. Perception. Good. What else? Yes.
Similar to that, we had, at one of our junior highs, they had mentors for each identified mentor had 4 or 5 students. It was the cafeteria manager, it was the custodian, it was the campus supervisor. And they would every day look for the kids, say, hi, I'm glad you're here. Just make them feel welcome about being at school. And if they weren't there, they would be the ones to call home and say, hey, I noticed you weren't here. You know.
And did you see with that mentoring, did you see an improvement?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And then even what had started happening is there became this competition among the mentor teams. You know, come on, I need you to be here because I gotta buy him dinner if my group doesn't outperform, you know.
The adults get competitive too.
Yeah.
Yes. Good. That's a good idea. Other ideas?
I attended the LCAP meeting at each of our schools and asked if the
Okay.
attendance goals were met and how they felt that it was going, if there could be improvements. It's
Okay.
a little bit softer data, but
Okay. No, but that's important too, because if you're going to be ultimately responsible for updating that LCAP or a part of those conversations, you need to get input from people. Okay, so let's look at reviewing data. We talked about that, those multiple measures of attendance. So we're looking at truancy, we're looking at chronic absenteeism. We should be looking at suspension, expulsion too, all of that. Evaluate the progress of your LCAP goals. So we talked about that too. Data generated from specific programs. The annual SARB report. And as we get into the afternoon and talk about SARB, the annual SARB report can provide you with some good information as well in terms of whether you're seeing changes that way. Survey stakeholders and analyze the results. And then this part kind of goes to your comment about interviewing people directly who are involved in the process. So students are a part of that, but also staff, families, and community members. So if what you've been doing, if you've been implementing programs or you've been trying software, you've been trying different things, get input from the people who are actually using it. So are your site people, do they find that the programs that you have are effective? The people who are responsible, whether it's your counselors, your intervention specialists, people working directly with the kids, are they finding that the strategies that you're using and trying to implement, are they being effective? Is there something else that would work better? So evaluating that, these are some different examples of what that might look like as well. So this gives us some ideas in terms of, again, these updated duties for supervisors of attendance. This is really what was called out when State SARB developed this and then it went through. These were the duties that people considered to be extremely important for supervisors of attendance. So for those of you in that role, this updated piece and how we focused this morning is really kind of the crux of the expectations for the supervisors of attendance. There are some additional pieces that we'll talk about in the next 15-20 minutes before we go to lunch. The next section that we talk about, there were some additional identified supports and interventions. We're going to go through those quickly because they'll get kind of folded into the SARB part in the afternoon. And then we'll talk about some of those other components like quickly the work permits and opportunity programs and stuff. I realize there are people in the room who don't run those programs or it's the wrong grade level for you. So I realize that it may not pertain to your daily responsibilities, but we want to make sure that we cover it as part of the training. And you never know, you may change jobs, you may change districts. This could be a new part of your responsibilities, but you're covered as a part of the training. So additional duties, we all kind of feel like this sometimes. The many hats that we wear and the responsibilities we have, but additional things to consider. Support services and interventions. So as part of that same piece of legislation that updated the duties, there was also a section in there that talked about this, that the supervisor of attendance may provide support services and interventions, which may include but are not limited to any or all of the following. Again, that's a lot of may and interesting terms that are thrown in there. What they wanted to do was talk about some of the pieces of work that could be included, again, under the supervisors of attendance. A lot of this, for those of you that are running effective SARBs, you're going to see pieces of this as part of the SARB process that we'll talk about more this afternoon. But conferencing, promoting extracurricular, co-curricular activities, recognizing students who have good attendance or who have improved their attendance. This is a lot of what we do when we talk about SARB. Referrals And referrals could be to a lot of different people or agencies: school nurses, school counselors, school psychologists, school social worker, or other personnel for the cases of case management or counseling. I know that in a lot of school districts, when we had the downturn in the economy a few years ago, they got rid of a lot of those support positions. So we scaled back on things like school social workers and counselors just as a budget concern. I think with LCAP, we're starting to see districts go the opposite direction and get back to hiring some of those support positions. So hopefully you will have a more robust group of people or attendance team that can help support with these activities. Collaboration with child welfare agencies, law enforcement, courts, public health care agencies, government agencies to help support us, and we're lucky today to have someone here from CPS. Collaborating with school study teams, guidance teams, SARTs, other intervention-related teams to assist the pupil and his or her caregivers, parents, or guardians. So we're going to talk about that component this afternoon as well. In schools with significantly higher rates of chronic absenteeism, identifying barriers to attendance. So we'll have to talk about that. This one, they're specifically talking about school-wide strategies rather than case management of an individual student. So some of the barriers that we're talking about related to attendance are not specific to a student, but kind of generalized to the larger school. An example of that might be something like safety. So if school safety is a concern, that's not, it can be with one particular student if there are issues, but it could also be a larger issue like we talked about at Parkland. So that would be an example of a potential barrier that could impact a lot of other people. Referrals for assessments and plans that are in place through 504 special education. Referrals to SARB, again this afternoon, referral to a truancy mediation program. We'll talk about that this afternoon as well. So in addition to the 5 duties that we talked about, this legislation also calls out these different support services and interventions that are part of kind of the day-to-day work of attendance supervisors. So as a reminder, those were pieces in there as well. Okay, so now we're going to get to the other things that were listed in the original part of the legislation related to work permits. So with work permits, there are a lot of different pieces to this. There are a lot of kind of exceptions and ages and conditions and things like that. We're going to talk about this in general terms. If you have a really specific question pertaining to something in your district, then during lunchtime I'd be happy to talk with you about those specifics. But in education code, when you start with, I think it's 49-110, there's a whole big section on employment of minors and different components of that. So it can get really super specific, and again, there are a lot of people in the room that this might not even pertain to based on the age of the kids that you serve. So it's within the discretion of the district supervisor of attendance or other person designated in writing by the superintendent whether a minor who is still subject to compulsory attendance laws may obtain a work permit. So on these slides, we're going to provide you as much as possible with the education codes attached to it for those of you that like to go and explore even more and look into this. In terms of a permit to employ and work form, so there's a form that you can find on the CDE that kind of lists for you some of the different information that should be included on a permit to employ and work form. No school official can issue a blank work permit to the minor in the interest of expediency. Like, you've never had this happen, right? I need this for my employer right now, just can you give me a blank one? No, we can't give you a blank work permit. It doesn't work that way. So in the interest of expediency, I know sometimes everything is super urgent when it's last minute, but we can't do that. The work permit issuer has to complete the relevant sections of the work permit, and it needs to be returned completely by the employer before the student is authorized to work. Emancipated minors, so here's one of those things that's kind of an exception. In the work permit world, there's lots of things that have exceptions. The only exception in child labor and compulsory attendance laws is for emancipated minors. They may apply for a permit to employ and work without a parent's permission because they're emancipated. An emancipated minor may sign in place of the parent. Okay, and this is part of the family code. The qualifications to be an emancipated minor, so this only applies to a very specific subgroup of the population. Emancipated minors must be at least 14 years old, They do not live with the parent or guardian. And if the parent or guardian who have either consented to it or not actively seeking to get the youth back. So students who are out on their own, able to earn income and manage their own finances. So you're talking about 14, 15, 16-year-old who has to be able to have their own income and support themselves. The source of income must be legal. I find it interesting that they point that out in education code. I'm glad they do. We're all thinking it, but source of income must be legal, and it has to be in the best interest of the youth. So cases where we've seen emancipation, very unusual cases for the most part. It's not your typical type situation. Usually with this, you see high-profile cases of like child actors or something like that. They get emancipated from their parents. They want to manage their own finances. They want to live on their own. They want to work. They want to do their own thing. They would meet these qualifications here. So that would be an example of what that is. Thinking about truancy and dropouts, again, in terms of work permits, students fall under compulsory ed. We don't want to provide them with work permits if they're not currently attending school because that kind of sanctions that activity. So we want to make sure that they're in attendance. For students, again, this is another group of kids who have passed the high school proficiency exam. So some of you are encouraging that for some of your kids who have unusual circumstances. Kids who pass that do not need work permits, but under federal law, they do have to have a certificate of age, which can be satisfied with the top portion of the work permit application. So thinking about those pieces, if you have kids who are taking this proficiency exam, having conversations with them about what they're going to do following that. Are they going to work? Are they going to school? What are they doing following the completion of that exam? If they are looking to work, talking them through this process and what they would need to be able to do that. 14 or 15-year-olds may not be employed while school is in session and may not work more than 3 hours in any day, nor more than 18 hours in any week, nor during school hours. Students enrolled in and employed in a school supervised and school administered work experience and career exploration program may be employed for no more than 23 hours per week and may work during school hours. So in specific circumstances, this can apply. Entertainment work permits. Do you guys have a lot of those in this area? A couple here or there? Okay. So the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement issues all entertainment industry work permits. There's the code listed for you there. For school-age children in grades 1 through 12, an authorized school official must certify that the minor's attendance, health, and scholastic records are satisfactory. So if a family is seeking an entertainment permit, they need to bring it to you to sign off on, and you're looking for these factors to make sure that the student is essentially in good standing. Again, there's a lot of different rules related to this, especially for kids at certain age levels and those who are actively working in the entertainment industry. Some exceptions for work permits. If your parent is the employer, it's a parent family-owned business. When the parent or guardian is training his or her child in the family business and no pay is received. Agricultural, horticultural, viticultural, or domestic work performed outside of school hours on land that is owned or operated by the family. So school districts or state local government agencies, not subject to work permits, but must have a certificate of age to verify permissible age and to provide proof of age. Continuation schools, this was also part of the original definition of what supervisors of attendance oversaw. Students who attend continuation high schools must spend at least 15 hours per week or 3 hours per day at school. The intent of continuation schools was to provide an opportunity for kids to meet graduation requirements. It might also emphasize occupational orientation or a work-study schedule. We've seen a big shift in continuation schools. I serve on the AXA Ed Options Council, and when we have people sitting on that council, there are some people who have done some really amazing things with continuation school. There's been kind of a push in the continuation school world to change the impression of what they have been or what they are to something that much more closely matches what the comprehensive sites are, to be able to offer all of the services and resources of a comprehensive site. So the idea is to meet the educational needs of students. Typically they're smaller campuses, they feel a little more personalized. And again, from district to district, this varies a little bit in terms of what's offered. Opportunity education was established to provide additional support for students. In terms of how that gets taken care of, the governing board, district superintendent, or a person designated in writing by the governing board, could be the supervisor of attendance, may assign identified students to an opportunity program or class schedule. So this is another educational option for students. The issue with this is that as a result of the pupil retention block grant that happened in 2004, it repealed the authority for school districts to establish new opportunity education programs. So if you had one in place and you were operating it, then you're good to go with continuing those programs. If you did not have a program prior to this time and contact CDE and talk about trying to develop a new one, they'll tell you that as a result of this, no new opportunity programs can be established. Okay? So again, if you have them, you've been operating them, you're fine, but in terms of a new alternative ed program, that's something that is not going to be an option, at least for the time being. Okay? So those were the other areas that were kind of touched on in legislation, but again, the priorities are really focusing on those new updated duties. After lunch, Sal told me I had to get you guys out of here by about 11:45. After lunch, we are going to focus on the SARB process. We're going to be looking at the steps that need to take place along the way to make sure that you are following education code, following the due process, following the notification pieces, the development of a strong, effective SARB, who needs to be there, what the meetings look like, and all of those kinds of pieces. So after lunch, that's what we will be looking at. I believe Sal explained that lunch on your own, yes.
I have a question about this, work permits.
Uh-huh.
Say a student's fine, we issue the work permit, and then all of a sudden their attendance tanks. We have the right
Yes.
to retract that work permit,
Yes,
correct?
because if there's pieces, it does say in the code, and I can show that to you at lunchtime, it does talk about whether it's the division of labor that does the entertainment work permits or the agency that issues the permits. If there's any change to information that was presented on those forms, or you find out that there was falsification, whether it's like age or eligibility or something like that, that you have the right to address those and revoke those. So I can show that to you at lunchtime. Okay, so I want to be true to my word with Sal. He asked to release you by 11:45. We're right about there. And he said 1 hour lunch. So if you'll be back at 12:45, and we will wrap up with the SARB pieces and talk about that, and then that will officially have you certified. He will talk to you about what the steps of getting all of that board approved and how you get approved with your districts. He'll talk about that once we get back